Hi, everyone. Super Bowl champ Vernon Davis here from Legal Help Center. If you've been injured in an accident and think you deserve compensation, listen up, because we have legal professionals standing by right now to answer your questions for free. You can find out if you have a case and how much it's potentially worth.
Thanks, Vernon. You heard it, folks. If you've been injured, call and find out how much you qualify for. Call 800-497-4410. Advertisement sponsored by Legal Help Center. May not be available in all states.
Welcome back to the History of the Papacy podcast, a podcast about the popes of Rome and Christian Church. Prepare yourself to step behind the ropes and leave the official tour of the story of the popes and Christianity. I am your host, Steve Guerra, and I thank you for joining me on this journey. Hey, everybody. Welcome to the History of the Papacy podcast. I'm your host, Steve, and today we are officially kicking off a brand new series that has been a long time in the making. The history of the Catholic Church in the United States from the Revolutionary War to the start of the Civil War. Now, I'll be honest with you, just figuring out how to begin this story has been a bit of a challenge. The Catholic Church didn't suddenly appear in the United States in 1776. So before we even get to the birth of the United States, we have to ask, how did the Catholic Church get to the East Coast of North America in the first place? And for those of you listening from outside of the United States, it's probably helpful to step back and take a broader look at how the country itself came together. The timeline from 1776 to 1861 covers just 85 years. That old 40 and, just about 7 years ago, we've heard so much about. But the changes in that time period are enormous, politically, culturally, geographically, and especially religiously. The story of the Catholic Church in America doesn't just sit in a vacuum either. It overlaps with the larger story of Catholicism around the world, particularly the Church in Europe and in other parts of the Americas, the Church in Mexico, French Canada, the Caribbean, and even South America all had their own histories unfolding at the same time. And those stories sometimes intersect with what was happening in the United States. We also can't ignore the fact that the Catholic Church in the United States didn't only exist within the original 13 colonies. These colonies were already diverse in their histories and religious makeup, but as the United States expanded to the west and to the south, wars, purchases, and treaties, it absorbed territories where Catholic communities had already been established for many generations. So while we're focusing on the years between 1776 and 1861, we're going to have to make some decisions. There are a lot of threads we could follow, and believe me, there are so many great stories to tell, but we'll aim to keep the series focused and digestible. That said, you can count on plenty of fascinating characters, dramatic moments, and unexpected twists along the way. Now, we'll start addressing some of the questions we just raised, looking at how the Catholic Church first arrived in what would become the United States and why that backstory matters for understanding the rest of the journey. All right, let's start answering some of these big questions I laid out. First things first, in this episode, we're going to take a look at some of the deep background of the Catholic Church in the Americas, really just how it got here. And yes, I'm going to use here because, well, I'm here. We're not going to do a full deep dive, but just enough to get our feet planted and understand where the story begins. Secondly, we'll take a broad look at how the idea of the United States came to be. This is the basic overview, especially the parts leading up to the American Revolution. We'll revisit some of these themes in later episodes, but for now, we just want the broad strokes to set the stage. As the series progresses, we'll also touch on how the Catholic Church in the U.S. interacted with the popes of Rome and the wider Catholic world. We won't get too far into the weeds with European church history, but we'll highlight the moments when those global developments directly impact what was happening on this side of the Atlantic. If you're interested in a super deep dive into what was happening in Rome and the broader European church during this same general time frame, you might want to check out our series on Pius X, called The End of an Era. That'll give you the detail we won't be able to cover here. These two series will definitely pair well together. And finally, here's how we're going to approach the story geographically. As the United States expands west and south, we'll circle back and provide the historical and Catholic context for each region as we go. That way, we're not front-loading everything in one giant info dump. There's just too much. And honestly, some of that background, regional background, is essential to making sense of the bigger picture. Next up, we'll take a look at how European powers politically and religiously planted the seeds for Catholicism in America long before the United States was even a thought. Oh, wait, do you have a moment? A great way to support the History of the Papacy podcast is by joining us on Patreon at patreon.com/history of the papacy. Your support on Patreon goes such a long way to help keep the History of the Papacy sustainable and on the air for a long time in the future. There are 4 tiers of support on Patreon: Antioch, Alexandria, Constantinople, and Rome. Each of these tiers represents one of the traditional patriarchates of early Christianity. There are many great benefits to you for supporting the show on Patreon. You will receive early and advertisement-free content, bonus episodes, monthly book drawings, and most importantly, you will be included on the History of the Papacy diptychs. In traditional Christianity, the diptychs are the lists of bishops commemorated in the order of their precedence. The sooner you sign up on Patreon, the higher you will be on the lists of the History of the Papacy patrons. Now, here's a brief message from our sponsors. Let's roll that clock back a little bit, way back, and take a look at the very early Catholic presence in North America. Now, technically, it all starts with the fall of the Roman Empire. Okay, not really, but kind of. There's 2 major introductions of the Catholic Church into North America that we need to talk about. Now, where it does get back to the Roman Empire is really with the Catholic Church and with Christianity, the story really separates after the fall of the Roman Empire into Northern Europe and especially Northwestern Europe and then Southern Europe around the Mediterranean. So you have these 2 different geographical areas that they overlap in some ways, the old Germanization and Romanization issue that we've talked about in previous episodes. But the 2 fountainheads, you might say, of Catholicism in the New World blast out of those 2 regions that really develop out of culturally from the fall of the Roman Empire. But first, before we get into any of that, is let's address the whole debate around who actually discovered America. Obviously, there were people living in the Americas long before any Europeans arrived. And sure, this is a great opportunity to go off on a lengthy sidetrack about the origins of humanity in the Americas, but we're going to stay focused. focus. We do know for sure that there were Europeans in North America several hundred years before the Spanish showed up in 1492. In the late 900s, Eric Thorvald's son, better known as Eric the Red, left Iceland and settled Greenland. He was the first quote-unquote modern European to settle in North America. Eric himself wasn't Christian, since the North were only just starting to dip their toe into Christianity by that point. But his wife was a Christian, and so was his son, Leif Erikson. Leif and his siblings left Greenland and explored further west, settling in a place called Vinland. That wasn't in what we would call the United States proper, but they did likely travel further south than this area of Vinland, which is in the Maritimes of Canada, into maybe possibly Maine or even further south. Whether they brought a priest or something is not known, but you can speculate if they did travel and they were Christians, that they very likely would have brought a priest along with them on their adventures. Greenland itself remained populated by the Norse for several centuries, though the colony faded out. Still, we know they built churches there, actual Catholic churches, and maintained a very loose connection to the broader church. Their contact was so tenuous that even Iceland was considered far away. But they were technically part of the Catholic Church. After all, this Greenland colony existed and died out over 100 years before the Reformation, or maybe approximately 100 years. We'll say the century before, and well before any of the churches in Northern Europe separated from Rome. So we're not talking about the United States yet, but we're getting close. Then, just a few decades after Greenland's Catholic presence vanished, other European voyages kicked off this age of exploration, this time from that southern Europe we were talking about. So let's get into Christopher Columbus. Columbus had no idea where he was going, or maybe he had a rough idea. He knew he was going west to go to the east, but we don't know for sure. The tale is that he thought he was heading for Asia, but that's definitely not where he landed. The very first Catholic Mass in the Americas was celebrated in 1494 at La Isabela on the island of Hispaniola, what we now today call the Dominican Republic. The first Catholic Mass in what would become a U.S. territory was in Puerto Rico, also in 1494. A few decades later, Spanish explorer Tristan de Luna y Arellano sailed through the Gulf of Mexico, officially called the Gulf of America these days. Go look it up on Google Maps, but that name might not stick forever. Anyways, in 1559, de Luna stopped in what is now Pensacola, Florida, and celebrated Mass there. I've actually seen the beach where that may have happened. It's a beautiful beach, by the way, sugar white sand in Florida. When we went, it was a bit cold, but still a great spot if you ever have a chance to visit. As a matter of fact, the seeds for the idea of this series were planted during that cold beach vacation during the height of the COVID-19 pandemic. Also, incidentally, right after a major hurricane. Maybe that's why it was so cheap. Anyways, the Spanish eventually settled Florida, but on the Atlantic side in St. Augustine. And from there, they just kept going north. The Spanish expanded north from the Caribbean and Gulf region, bringing the church with them well into what would become Georgia and South Carolina and even further north. Meanwhile, the French were exploring and settling down from the north, from Canada, doing basically the same thing as the Spanish, just in reverse. We'll get into more detail about those settlements when they become more directly tied into our main story. Now, as for English Catholics, which we will talk about a lot more later, the first Mass they celebrated in what would become the United States was in 1634 on St. Clement's Island. That's really where we'll start the main line of the Catholic Church history in the United States. Before we move on, I've got to mention one more possibility, kind of in the we'll never know, but maybe category. The voyage of St. Brendan, also known as Brendan the Navigator. We actually did a few episodes on him already, so go back and check those out if you're curious. The short version, he was an Irish monk that lived in the 500s AD, and according to his hagiography, he and his crew set out in small leather boats called carracks on a wild sea voyage. They had all kinds of adventures and supposedly visited lands unknown to Europeans. Now, this isn't impossible. People have actually recreated the kind of boat that he would have used and proven it could make the trip across the North Atlantic. We know Irish monks were already in Iceland when the Norse got there, so there is some precedent. Whether Brendan made it to North America, we'll never know, but it's a great story, and it reminds us that it isn't out of the question that others might have made similar voyages that were never recorded or remembered. Honestly, if a sailor knew what they were doing getting to North America and back, even very early on in history, wasn't an impossible task. But again, we'll never really know. So let's talk about the grand scope of U.S. history leading up to the Revolution of 1775. We'll start with the abortive settlement of Roanoke Island in North Carolina in 1585. This colony didn't last long, and the entire colony simply disappeared. There's a ton of archaeology and speculation, but that being said, the colony is just dead in the timeline, and we don't really have to discuss it anymore. It did include the first English person born in the Americas, Virginia Dare, which is a fun little fact. The next major push was the Jamestown settlement in Virginia in the year 1607. That one almost failed as well, but it did wind up sticking. They even set up a parliamentary system called the House of Burgesses not much later than the starting of the colony. This is the time of John Smith, Pocahontas, John Rolfe, Sir Walter Raleigh, and all that. African slavery was introduced to English America. The Pilgrims, a group of what you might call religious separatists or even radicals, are also called the Puritans, which we'll get into a little bit, not a super deep dive of where these groups came from, because they were so key in the founding ethos of America. These groups set up a colony called Plymouth Colony in 1620, including they wrote a major and majorly important founding document of American history called the Mayflower Compact. The Dutch settled in the area of New Amsterdam, which would become New York in 1626. They purchased the Manhattan for the supposedly $24 in shells and beads. The English conquered New Amsterdam in 1664. New York would continue with the strong Dutch influence for many years. And another fun fact, a president who lived during the time period we'll be discussing in this series spoke Dutch as his first language and English as his second. Important for our tale, the Maryland Charter was granted to Cecil Calvert in 1632, and he was a Catholic. We'll go into more detail on that in this series as well. In 1675, King Philip's War broke out, a major war between the English and Native American peoples of New England. Conflict with Native Americans will be a major theme throughout the series. In 1676, 100 years before the American Revolution, there was Bacon's Rebellion in Virginia, and this was really a major precursor to the gripes that will lead to the American Revolution. Little bits and pieces of conflict between the colonials and the home island will just start to develop, and early seeds planted in as early as 1676. even before the foundation of Pennsylvania. So not even all of the colonies were in place. Pennsylvania wasn't founded until 1682. Pennsylvania wasn't Catholic, but it was really established as a place for religious tolerance, especially for a group of Christians called the Quakers. Things get really interesting in 1754 with the French and Indian War, which would set off eventually the 7 Years' War. So you may have heard of the 7 Years' War in European history, especially for our European friends, because that was a really key set of battles and wars for European history. But maybe the little known fact, I don't know, but an important fact is a guy we'll become familiar with named George Washington is the one who started the whole war. He started the French and Indians War, which led to the 7 Years' War. The conflict was between Great Britain and France over the control of the Ohio country and what is now Ohio, Western Pennsylvania, going in toward the Mississippi River. Britain won the war and took over French areas in the north, including what is modern-day Canada. This set the British firmly in control of the area that would become the United States. The war ended in 1763, just a dozen years before the American Revolution. This war really led to the major problems between the British colonies and the British Crown. And all those little conflicts that were bubbling up come to the fore at the end of this conflict. Really, the big story is the British Crown needed money badly. All this new territory they had scored from the French needed to be defended. They needed taxes. Additionally, the British Crown incurred tons of debt fighting the war, a war incidentally started by colonial militia. This war needed to be paid for. The French and Indian War was the instigator of this much bigger conflict that the British, in a way, weren't financially prepared for, and they certainly weren't financially prepared for the aftermath. One thing that the British didn't want American colonists doing was spreading too far west and upsetting the delicate relationship with the Native American Indians who lived there. So the Americans desperately wanted to go west, but they also didn't want to pay taxes without representation in the British Parliament. They probably didn't want to pay taxes, period, to be honest. They hadn't really been paying much in the way of taxes the whole time, essentially. The colonists also wanted to spread west. There was great land in the west to expand to. The east was getting full, not really in the grand scheme of things, but land was getting tighter. By the 1760s and early 1770s, the British Crown started implementing new taxes and laws on the colonists. This included quartering troops in people's personal homes and enforcing much more direct rule than the British had before. Steve here with a quick word from our sponsors. In 1770, the Boston Massacre occurred, a major event in American history and historiography. A small, what you might call riot, ended with the British military firing into the crowd. 5 colonists died, including Crispus Attucks, a freed former African slave. By 1772, American colonists began organizing something called Committees of Correspondence, which was a loose network of groups in various cities that organized to share ideas, complaints, and information. In 1773, something called the Boston Tea Party took place, where a group of American colonists protested taxes, especially on tea, by dumping tons of tea into Boston Harbor. In 1774, the British passed a new laws the Americans found intolerable. The Americans, in fact, called them the intolerable acts. The British called them the coercive acts. Not exactly much better branding, honestly. They could have rethought that, like the new American idea on British taxation or something. I think nowadays they would have come up with a much better name for those laws than coercive acts. But actual fighting broke out in Massachusetts in April of 1775 between the colonials and the British at the Battle of Lexington and Concord. A large group of militia called the Minutemen fought the British, forcing them miles in a running scrape back to Boston. In June of 1775, the Battle of Bunker or Breed's Hill took place, another major American victory that essentially ended British dominance in New England. Another major victory came in South Carolina in June of 1776, and then July 4th, 1776. You may have heard of that date. The American colonists declared independence from Britain. It wasn't a foregone conclusion. Many Americans wanted to remain loyal and work out their differences with the crown. Those Americans were called loyalists, or Tories. The war was not a cakewalk for the Americans. It looked like they would lose dramatically at many points and decisively as well. But in 1778, the Americans got a major boost when the French got involved. In modern terms, you might say the French were involving themselves in a proxy war. Other European powers would also back the U.S. in this proxy war against the British. The war ended on the battlefield in 1781 when the Americans trapped a major contingent of British forces at Yorktown, Virginia. The official end of the war occurred in 1783 with the Treaty of Paris. Great Britain recognized the United States as an independent country, and the borders were set between the U.S. and British North America. The seeds of a second conflict between the U.S. and Great Britain were already being planted. So that's the American Revolution in its broadest strokes. There's so much more detail and so many great stories. This is the basic ground that we need to cover to understand where the Catholic Church story begins. Now let's even get into the grander scope of U.S. history leading up to the Civil War in 1861. I won't dive into too much detail in this section, but it's important to lay out the broader picture. As we move from the Revolution of 1776 to the outbreak of the Civil War in 1861, we'll see some major themes shaping the United States and shaping the Catholic Church's experience within the country. We'll talk about westward expansion and the idea of manifest destiny. This is the belief that the United States was meant to stretch from coast to coast, the Atlantic to the Pacific. This expansion wasn't just geographic, it was cultural and religious as well. We'll also see the formation of a unique American identity. That includes the crafting of the U.S. Constitution, which in a lot of ways was a reaction to the gripes that the colonists had with England, and the development of a new kind of political and religious landscape, different from anything in Europe. Throughout this period, the United States fought more wars, both against foreign powers and within its own borders. There was complex and often brutal relations with the Native American nations. A big part of the tension in this period comes from divided loyalties between different regions of the U.S., the North, the South, the growing Wests, what would become called sectionalism. These divisions played out in economic, cultural, politics, and yes, even religion. Then there's also the massive explosion of industrialization, which leads into and plays a lot of part in mass immigration into the United States at that time period. The cities are getting bigger, but also plantations in the South are getting stronger to fuel resources into that industrial system, which leads us to another thing that we cannot overlook. And probably the biggest and most explosive issue of that time was slavery. It was a central question in American society and influenced everything, including how Catholics engaged with their faith, their neighbors, and their nation. These are the forces that lead us from the birth of the United States in 1776 to its fracture in 1861. They form the historical landscape where our story of the Catholic Church in the United States will unfold. So that's where we'll leave it right now. We've got a sense of where we're going to begin, and more importantly, why we're starting there. The Catholic presence in North America didn't start with the United States, but those early stories from Greenland to the Caribbean to Florida and beyond will help us understand the roots of the Church on this continent. As we progress, we'll dive into the early English settlements of North America and where Catholics enter the scene. And so join us as we continue. Up next.
The Historical Jesus Podcast is the sweeping saga of the life and times of Galilean Jesus of Nazareth, as well as the faith, religion, and church founded to honor and disseminate his acts and teachings. Join me, Mark Vinette, on this fascinating journey through time, exploring the many great works of Christian theology, literature, architecture, music, and art inspired by the words and deeds of Jesus Christ.